Today, we're talking about recent comments from an online progressive commentator who misrepresented the HousingFirst model for solving homelessness, which is unproductive, harmful, and disappointing. My name is Brittany Page. This is The Page Perspective. That progressive commentator is Kasparian of the Young Turks, an online progressive news network. I haven't spent a lot of time watching TYT, but they're increasingly appearing in my feed as the two hosts there, Cenk Uygur and Kasparian, spend more time talking about crime in California or the homelessness crisis. And of course, Cenk is now running for president. I don't know them personally, but they have built a very successful platform and certainly have a lot to be proud of in helping to advance progressive ideas and encourage people to support progressive policies. I think that's what makes this misrepresenting of HousingFirst so harmful and so disappointing. I came across this segment where Kasparian discussed a recent article in the New York Times about the number of people living in their cars as housing becomes increasingly unaffordable, specifically in California. That New York Times article is an important read, by the way. It focuses on a woman who is employed as a social worker with the Washington state government, making over $72,000 a year, who found herself homeless living in her car with her daughter. I recommend you read it, but let's set that aside for now and let's hear Kasparian's take on the homelessness crisis and what she views as the solution to the problem.
Homelessness is actually a complex problem, okay? Ignore what anyone on both sides of the political aisle, the extremes, have to say because they want to simplify it. It is not simple. There are some people who are just, they're priced out of the market. They have no other choice, so they're living in their cars, but they're not dealing with any other issue. They just desperately want to get into housing. Then there are people who have severe mental health issues, and you have to deal with that issue in order to eventually get them into permanent housing. And then there are people who have serious drug addiction. They're not able to think correctly about their situation. They need a different form of help. They need rehabilitation. So like the way that we've been handling this issue has been driving me so crazy because people want to simplify it, okay? No, housing first. Yes, for some, housing first, absolutely. For Audette, housing first, absolutely. But it doesn't work for everyone because there are other underlying issues. And finally, we need to build more housing. The reason why the prices have gone up and skyrocketed is because as we continue to increase our population, we don't have enough places for people to live. Yeah. So build it.
So first, a point of agreement. Yes, absolutely. Build more housing, build more affordable housing, support low-income housing in your neighborhood, support rent control, support a lot of things that go hand in hand with affordable housing, but also support housing first. And yes, for everyone. Why? Well, because housing first does not mean housing only. And please, if you take one thing away from this video, let it be that housing first does not mean housing only. We cannot let this right-wing talking point win, especially in left-wing circles. Now, Housing First is an approach to ending homelessness created in 1992 by clinical psychologist Sam Simbaris. Contrary to what you heard in that clip from Anna, Housing First began with the most vulnerable, and to some people, the most difficult population, a population that often earns the title hard to reach or treatment resistant. But that population is where Housing First began, with people who were actually living on the street, who struggle with active psychiatric symptoms, with severe mental illness, and with substance use disorders. Housing First was big because it represented a departure from the typical approach to working with this population, which is called housing readiness. Now, with housing readiness, people had to meet certain criteria in order to indicate that they were ready for housing, whether that be sobriety conditions or treatment or medication compliance. Housing First changed the order of operations in that it did not require that someone experiencing mental illness or substance use first get sober or graduate through a series of programs to ensure that they have reached some semblance of stability to prove that they are ready for housing. No, it said in order to gain that stability, you first need shelter. You need housing. And with housing, we will offer services to address mental health and substance use issues. And if you just think about this logically, it makes more sense, right? I mean, how in the hell did we ever think it was best for someone to get sober or remain medication compliant or stay in treatment when they don't know where they're going to sleep that night? When they are daily at risk of violence, exposed to the elements, have to strategically plan how they will use the bathroom and where. Housing First does not mean that you walk up to someone experiencing psychosis, offer them a key, put them in an apartment, and say, good luck. It means you get them housed to provide that initial stability that then creates a foundation from which they can receive help to address their additional needs. That's it. But this is the problem with listening to commentators, even ones who call themselves progressive, who often lack the education or experience necessary to accurately opine on these issues. So let's turn to the expert on this, clinical psychologist Sam Simbaris, who I mentioned before, the man who is credited with creating the Housing First model. He appeared on the podcast 99% Invisible a few years ago, and he talked about the population that Housing First targets.
Here's the criteria. No matter what the person looks like, if you see they're able to survive on the street by virtue of their survival on the street, in that tent or in that park, and as smelly and as awful as they look, if they're surviving on the street, they can definitely survive in an apartment.
So let's stop playing this game. We can all recognize there is a problem with people who live on the street while experiencing severe mental health issues and substance use disorders, cycling in and out of hospitals, jails, and short-term treatment centers, who then end up back on the street in the same place they started. And as progressives, we want to help stop that cycle. We want to put an end to homelessness. So why would we disregard the Housing First model that was created specifically to target populations that Anna seems to believe are harder to help? And listen, before you comment, Sam Simbaris agrees that there are some people who need more institutionalized care. Of course, there will always be people who need that. But he maintains that for most people, they do not need to be sober or medicated before being housed in order to successfully transition out of homelessness. And it isn't just him. The research backs this up. Housing First, housing itself, provides that crucial initial stability that then allows a treatment team to come in and assist with the remaining issues and concerns. And again, let's just turn to the evidence here. And as always, I link to all of my sources in the description of this video. I came across several articles that summarize the evidence well, but I think this one from the National Low Income Housing Coalition was the best because it references numerous studies and links directly to those studies in the document. Reading from that now, Housing First programs reduce homelessness, increase housing stability, and improve quality of life for people who are experiencing homelessness. Evidence from a systemic review shows Housing First programs more effectively reduce homelessness and improve housing stability for unhoused individuals. Housing First programs also lead to reduced hospitalization and use of emergency health departments by people experiencing homelessness. A 2021 study found that Housing First programs decreased homelessness by 88% and improved housing stability by 41% compared to Treatment First programs. A recent study found that Housing First programs not only substantially reduced veteran homelessness, but also prevented a large increase in veteran homelessness. Both older and younger adults experiencing homelessness benefit from Housing First. Housing First can lead to better treatment outcomes. While an earlier study found no difference in treatment outcomes between Housing First and high barrier programs, some more recent studies indicate that Housing First participants are more likely than others to report reduced usage of alcohol, stimulants, and opiates. Again, here we have Housing First can reduce healthcare and other costs. A systemic review found that the economic benefits exceed the intervention cost for Housing First programs in the U.S., with societal cost savings of $1.44 for every dollar invested. The average cost savings to the public ranges from $900 to $29,400 per person per year after entry into a HousingFirst program. And we can go deeper into specific cities like Houston, which is a great success story when it comes to implementing HousingFirst. Reading from the New York Times. Houston, the nation's fourth most populous city, has moved more than 25,000 homeless people directly into apartments and houses. The overwhelming majority of them have remained housed after 2 years. The number of people deemed homeless in the Houston region has been cut by 63% since 2011, according to the latest numbers from local officials. Even judging by the more modest metrics registered in a 2020 federal report, Houston did more than twice as well as the rest of the country at reducing homelessness over the previous decade. Why? Housing first. And I could keep reading study after study, but I'm hoping that you're getting the point here. Now, before we get to the conclusion, I want to play just a short clip from Cenk because we don't want to leave him out, and he said something that's a problem as well. So we can't let him off the hook either.
But guys, like for example, in LA, 60% of the homeless live in their cars. Now, in LA is a super expensive city, and that's part of the reason why they're living in their cars. But they're not living out in the street, and they're not going around refusing help. A lot of the people on the streets refuse help. Why? Because they're having mental health problems or they're having addiction issues, and they want the quote unquote freedom to be able to stay on the streets and take drugs. That doesn't apply to everyone on the streets, but it does apply, unfortunately, to a big number, right?
No, not right. At least not without some sort of sourcing or stats on that. In my work as a therapist with this population, and in my work here on this channel or with my podcast, interviewing people who work in the field, it isn't that a large number of people want the freedom to do drugs. It's that they want the freedom to have their own space, to keep their belongings, to not have to lay on a cot in a room with dozens of people that they don't know, where they may be assaulted and have been assaulted. It's that their mental health conditions are sometimes exacerbated by those conditions, and they cannot control their hallucinations or delusions, as is the case with one unhoused man who was featured in this New York Times article about one of my heroes, Dr. Jim O'Connell, a doctor in Boston who is a champion for the homeless community there. And I want to read just a brief portion of that article now. Once they got used to seeing O'Connell at their encampments, many rough sleepers would chat. He often asked why they preferred to sleep outside rather than in the shelters. The most common answer began with a question. Had Dr. Jim ever tried to sleep in a shelter with 100 other people in the same room? Well, they just couldn't do it. Almost always they would add that he shouldn't think they chose to live outside. Offer them someplace else besides a shelter and they'd gladly move in. The most striking explanation came from a man who slept under one of the Starro Drive bridges, a sweet, soft-spoken fellow who suffered from schizophrenia. O'Connell had met him half a dozen times and given him coffee and blankets and socks and treated him for a few minor ailments. In the middle of a very cold night, afraid the man might die of hypothermia, O'Connell begged him to come to the Pine Street shelter. But the man demurred. Look, Doc, if I'm at Pine Street, I can't tell which voices are mine and which are somebody else's. When I stay out here, I know the voices are mine and I can control them a little. Has Cenk considered that? Has he talked to people on the street himself? Has Anna? Have they learned from the experts, from people studying and researching and working in the field? Living in Los Angeles and seeing visible poverty in the street does not make one qualified to talk about the root causes and solutions of homelessness, especially when they're just flat out wrong about what they're saying. And I know Anna has shared her story of being assaulted by a man that she believed to be homeless and intoxicated while she walked her dog in her neighborhood. And that is terrible. It is disgusting. It should never happen to anyone. And I am so sorry that it happened to her. I understand that this issue feels personal to her. It's personal to me too. I lived in Southern California for over a decade, and now I live in Washington, D.C., both areas with significant homeless populations. But I come at this from a different perspective, and a lot of that is because of my education and my training as a therapist. I've worked with people who are homeless. I've worked with people facing eviction and teetering on the edge like so many people are right now. I've sat across from people who were experiencing severe mental illness, severe substance use issues, as well as homelessness. I've worked in institutionalized settings as well, including inpatient psychiatric facilities in both Southern California and here in DC. So this is, in fact, very personal for me. I see and have seen this suffering up close and personal. So I don't appreciate it when people who have massive platforms that can inform and shift the way people think, I don't like when they use that platform in a way that then feeds into this idea that we need to hold people accountable for their suffering, rather than going after the systems that are perpetuating the suffering. We could solve homelessness tomorrow if we wanted to, but we lack the political will. And part of the reason we lack the political will is because people aren't educated on this issue. We could increase that political will if online commentators, especially popular ones, stopped obscuring the reality of the solutions to homelessness and instead started championing the realities. So I would ask you to please share this video with someone you think needs to hear the message. Let's change some hearts and minds. What do you think? I'd love to know. You can call and leave a voicemail at 657-464-7609 or send an email to idoubtit@dollemore.com. You can support my work on Patreon at patreon.com/idoubtitpodcast. And coming soon, look for an announcement for channel memberships. I am rolling those out in the next week. Thank you, as always, for being here. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Take care, and I will see you next time.